Hello, and welcome to the Big Questions podcast. This episode will be on geopolitics and its intersection with markets and economics. I'm your host, John Briggs, Global Head of Economics and Market Strategy for NatWest. And I'm joined once again by Scott Livingstone, who, just as a reminder for anybody who's new to the series, is the International Advisor to NatWest Group. Scott joined the bank after 24 years of service as a frontline diplomat in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, mostly in South Asia. Prior to that, he served as a dozen years as a Royal Marine officer, and his service was shaped by global security issues, especially post 9/11, including terrorism, cyber, and hostile state actors. Scott, thank you very much for once again joining us.
John, great to be here. Thank you.
Great. So a lot to go through here. It's hard to even know where to start sometimes in this ever more volatile world, but let's start in Israel and the Gaza war. What's your view on the state on the ground? And if there will not just be any end in sight, but is there any path to a sustainable ceasefire? We know it's being worked on now, but let's just start with the ceasefire before we think about the long run here. Is there any path to that in the near term?
So John, I think you're right to split it into those two bits. I think there is a pathway to a ceasefire, and one that lasts for 40 days, one that sees an opportunity for hostages to be released, and one that sees obviously a reduction in violence and an increase in humanitarian aid. However, those negotiations in Cairo at the moment are very difficult, and I have to say, not likely to succeed. And that's because Hamas at the moment is not releasing a list of hostages, and therefore the Israelis are not attending the talks. Now, that could be solved, and a lot of effort is going into it. The Americans, the Egyptians, the Qataris are leaning heavily into these talks. So it's not a foregone conclusion that it will fail, but it is looking very, very tenuous at the moment. But in terms of a sustainable ceasefire, I think that's a completely different conversation, and that will need some major shifts to take place, both in Tel Aviv in terms of the government outlook there about a long-term political solution to the Palestinian problem as they see it and their own defense, and also with regard to the Tel Aviv government feeling that they have succeeded in achieving their war objectives after the atrocities of last October. So, the release of hostages and sufficient degradation of Hamas as a threat to Israeli national defense. And we're a long way from those other objectives, John. So in summary, yes, there is a pathway to a ceasefire, everyone aiming for this before Ramadan, but in terms of a long-term solution, many, many steps away from that, John.
So that leads me actually to my next question, which was about domestic Israeli politics. I mean, is there any internal drive to pull the foot off the gas militarily, or do they need to have that vision of, all of those objectives being achieved?
I think, well, first of all, my impression is there is very little drive to take the foot off the gas militarily. And I'll come on to the area where I'm particularly worried, which is the northern border. But certainly in Gaza, I understand that the administration has considerable public support to pursue its war goals in Gaza, and that's even taking into account public protests seeking negotiations for the release of hostages. Even with that protest, there is public support for the campaign in Gaza. I think we need to not forget the northern flank and the fear of a repeat of the attack of October, but this time coming from Lebanese Hezbollah to the north. There's something like 85 to 100,000 Israeli citizens have been evacuated away from that border, and I understand that there's a considerable political pressure in Israel to see those families return to their houses and their homes in a safe manner, and that means Hezbollah moving away from that border. Now, as well as the negotiations in Cairo, John, there are negotiations happening in the region, in Lebanon, between Lebanon and Israel, aimed at coming up with an agreed solution to the proximity of Lebanese Hezbollah to the border. There is a historic UN resolution that directs that Lebanese Hezbollah should withdraw roughly about 30 kilometers from the Israeli border. and they haven't done that. And the negotiations now are talking about moving back Lebanese Hezbollah 10 kilometers from the border, which would be seen as sufficient to really reduce tensions. But right now, those negotiations are ongoing, and right now there is no agreement. And I have to say, I feel that the clock is ticking on this sense of risk in Tel Aviv. And if we don't see movement in these negotiations, if we don't see movement of Hezbollah fighters away from Israel, I have to say I do fear that the public momentum in Israel will give cause for another military front to be opened up in the north, and we would see an uptick in violence rather than a downtick in violence.
Okay. There's a couple things there. I'm going to come back to Iran's involvement a little bit here, more regionally, and obviously there's a Hezbollah attachment there. On the political side, I do want to add that from my side here in the U.S., I mean, the war is definitely becoming an issue for Biden politically. Initially it helped him, but he's been getting increased pressure from the left in general, and just from an electoral standpoint, Michigan, which is a key swing state, has a fairly large Muslim population that has previously helped him. Yeah. So thinking about the U.S. pressure, and you said they've been very involved lately in negotiations around a ceasefire. As we near the U.S. election, do you think pressure is going to increase? And even if it does, will Israel even listen?
So I think it already has increased, John, and I think you're right to make the connection. So something like 19% of Democrat voters in the primary in Minnesota voted uncommitted. So they didn't vote for Joe Biden. Something like 13% in Michigan. That's 100,000 voters in Michigan voted uncommitted. And from a Biden point of view, he knows the margins of success in November are so slender, particularly in swing states, including Michigan. So all of those votes matter, and he really cannot go into the November election with this protest element, who either they probably won't vote for Trump, but they might not vote at all, and that could lead to disaster for Biden. So it is a political issue, and leverage is being delivered through these primary elections. And I think we've seen that this week with Kamala Harris really dial up the US message to Israel, actually, in terms of asking for an immediate ceasefire. That's new language for Washington, and really putting the pressure on Tel Aviv to allow humanitarian assistance to get into Gaza. So we've seen the pressure be dialed up in Washington. Now we've also seen some signs that pressure is having traction in Tel Aviv. Nothing dramatic, but there are indicators that pressure is mounting. And I think we will see that continue as we go through towards the sort of the declared deadline for a ceasefire of the start of Ramadan on the 10th of March. And my final point on this, John, is the US, I think, will use all possible channels to deliver this pressure. At the moment, we have Benny Gantz, a senior Israeli politician who is not a member of the coalition, but he is a member of Netanyahu's war cabinet, and he's in Washington right now, having talks with the vice presidents and other officials, and that's really quite divisive in Israeli politics, and it really does send an indicator as to where the US would like to see Tel Aviv move. So pressure is already taking place. We are seeing some signs of it being responded to, but that will continue, I think, particularly this week as we head towards Ramadan. And there's a final push to get a ceasefire deal over the line this week.
Okay. So zooming out a little bit, you mentioned Hezbollah. We've got the Houthi rebels. We can talk on that in a second. But with the whole Iran mix, just trying to think of, the last time we had a conversation like this, you flagged, the next proxy escalation that coming from Iran. They're supplying the drones to Russia, the relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah, Houthi rebels. I mean, it's hard to see how any of these issues improve. But in addition to the northern border, is there any more regional proxy escalation? And how will the U.S. again? We might have a change in regime in the U.S. a change in leadership in the U.S. in a few months. But for now, is there any way the U.S. can I don't know, somehow stop some of these increasingly micro baby steps that are continuing to see escalation in the region, or what are you thinking about as risks for escalation in the region?
So I think the risks remain as they were before. Groups which are seen as proxies of Tehran are operating below the threshold of escalation. So, and I would include the Houthis in that space. So too in Syria, so too in Iraq, so too in Lebanon, just below the threshold. In some ways, the pressure from these groups, particularly in Iraq on the American presence there, has stabilized. It is not as acute as it was maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I'm pretty sure that's a result of some fairly complex diplomacy going on with the US at the heart of it, but using friendly nations in the region, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, for example. I think there will be an effort to try and not allow the conflict in Gaza or the conflict on Israel's border to escalate into a regional campaign. And actually, John, we've seen signals from Tehran that neither does Tehran want to see a regional war. Now, it might want to see ongoing friction in terms of rockets fired in the Red Sea or missiles fired across the Israeli northern border, but it seems to want to stop short of a regional war, and I think that's something that is keeping the region relatively stable at the moment. But there is a risk of escalation. Most probably accidental, I have to say, John. I think I've long said that the risk of escalation could come from catastrophic success of one of these proxies, either hitting a significant humanitarian target in Israel or sinking an American ship in the Red Sea. And I think we'd be having a different conversation were either of those scenarios to happen.
Yeah, and I think that Iran. It's reassuring they don't want a more regional conflict, but I think that they're probably perfectly happy to see America completely distracted by all these little mini conflicts, if you can even call them mini conflicts, going around the region. So, and I think about that with the Houthi angle, right? I mean, it's just yet another thing that the U.S. and allies are now entrenched in. Does the U.S. and the West have the capacity for all of this? And this is a larger question, of course, with Ukraine and everything else going on, but it feels like that we have conversations every few months and we have another thing to talk about and we're even more stretched than last time.
Yeah, so on paper, it does have capacity. On paper, on theory, the Western economies should be able to fund the sufficient security to deal with conflicts in three spaces across the globe. It's a question of, have we been investing? Have we lost time in building that capacity over the last 20 years? And that's a really interesting question, particularly for the Europeans. And do we have the will? Is there the will, the political will to use and to be prepared to be seen to use in terms of building a deterrence posture in conflicts around the world? And that then takes us into Western politics, particularly in the light of what could happen in the US election in November. But the short answer to your question is there should be the capacity. I think many people would see that the West is stretched extremely thin at the moment. And not only that, there is fragility on the horizon as we move into what could be a shift of administration in the States.
Yeah, and I think there's an overlay of that election through everything we're talking about. I have a feeling you and I in a few months are going to do like a US election geopolitical special.
Yeah.
Just handicapping potential outcomes.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we still have 8 months to go. It's going to be a long election year. Switching, but even related to that is some comments that Trump made of late, regarding NATO, and with that, I'm going to switch to Ukraine. I mean, so what are you watching here? And I ask this in the light of the fact that, from a market perspective or investor perspective, in a way, it's almost become a little bit of a background war, which makes me worry about complacency.
Yeah, I think you're right to be worried about complacency. I think there is a degree of and this is a rather dreadful phrase to use because there's still a brutal war going on, but there is a sense of a certain degree of stability now. As I said, there are brutal actions happening. People are losing their lives still now. Russians are gaining some ground, albeit in small patches of real estate, but they certainly seem to have momentum. Therefore, for me, it's the key issue to monitor is about sustainability, and that's something about Ukrainian manpower and the ability to build new forces and to regenerate trained military capability, and then money. And as we've seen, there's been good news and not so good news when it comes to the funding of the Ukraine war. The Europeans recently managed to push through a payment, 50 odd billion euros into Ukraine, despite some opposition from the Hungarians. But the key piece of funding is the funding from America, and that is still stuck in Congress. The House of Representatives are still blocking it. Now, this is something like the third bill that has been drafted is currently sitting with the Speaker. The Speaker is deciding whether or not it should go to a vote. And there are signs, I have to say, John, I've been speaking to some people who do report that there are indicators that there are some Republicans who would vote this bill through. So we would see funding coming through the US system. Now, I think that's another time-sensitive piece of work, along with the Gaza negotiations for a ceasefire. Because if we don't get this bill through Congress and military financing heading towards Kiev, then it will get tangled up in the US election, and Ukraine could have a real problem getting funding from America this summer, which would only worsen their position on the battlefield. John, I think there's one other point I want to make about the US funding, and it's sort of slightly stepping back from Ukraine, and also making a point about the US election, because I don't think we should associate this reluctance in the States for more funding for Ukraine. We should only associate it with Trump and the Trump wing of the Republican Party. My feeling is that this is a cross-aisle issue, and that effectively whoever wins the election in November will in some way be giving a message to the Europeans that they need to step up their defense. I mean, it touches back, John, on your point about, is there enough security capacity to deal with global situations? Frankly, America is stretched to cover Ukraine, Middle East, and China, Taiwan, and so the idea of America pivoting to Taiwan is not a fiction. That needs to happen, and I think Europeans will come under increasing pressure, regardless of whether Biden wins or whether Trump wins. Regardless of who wins that election, the European governments will be under pressure to step up the defence spending, and of course, as we all know, that comes at a time of economic hardship, cost of living crises, and other political issues in Europe. So that's not going to be a straightforward problem to solve for European governments.
Yeah, the timeline you talk about was, you really only have a limited amount of time before you get some of these things done into the summer, when it just all becomes dominated by elections is important. And I agree with you. I think there is still general broad-based support for Ukraine, or antipathy towards Russia, however you want to look at that. And so I share some confidence there that the politics, even at the grassroots level, is supportive of it. You just need to get it over the line for, over that wing of the party. When you think about the U.S. election, geopolitics actually doesn't tend to drive voting in the U.S. It's all domestic issues that dominate. There was a monthly Gallup poll that asks, like, what's the nation's most important problem? And things like Russia, Middle East, national security, they each only garnered 1%. But the thing is, the economy dominates right now, and immigration is also an important factor. But the economy dominates. When you think about the elections and the result, it could dramatically impact the overlap of geopolitics and economics, right? And then the clearest path for this is from geopolitics to the economy is the U.S. relationship with China. I mean, neither Trump nor Biden disagree that China is our main adversary, but the approach, I think, is going to be very different. Even if substantively you end up in a similar place over a couple of years, stylistically, it's very different, and perhaps much more uncertain under Trump, more volatile. But we think about Trump's advocating greater tariffs across the board. That obviously probably starts with China, given our trade relationship, or have the largest impact. So as we think about this run up to the elections, and our current relationship with China's dealing with a lot of domestic economic issues, which has perhaps maybe cooled things off on a geopolitical tension front, or maybe it's just that the media is distracted by all these other conflicts going on. I guess my question is current relationship, and then how do you think China is going to act in the run up to the elections? Do you think that they'll just keep quiet? Will they, I don't know, try to steer things one way or the other? I think their ability to influence the U.S. is extremely limited. But how do you feel like, how do you feel like them acting? Could they stir up geopolitical tensions to try to get one candidate or the other, or is it a keep quiet and just cross your fingers?
Yeah, I have to say, I think you're right. I think you've got the components of an answer in there, John. There are domestic issues to deal with. We've seen recently some sort of landmark political speeches talking about focusing on economic growth. They're still aiming for 5% or something to see that economic development move forward. And there's been a sense that that needs to be the focus of Chinese political thinking. However, we've also seen an emphasis on security, and actually in the National People's Congress this week, interestingly enough, some commentators have drawn out that there was an omission of some key language about Taiwan, which is about the hope for a peaceful reunification. Now, some people are putting that out as an escalation, but that could be taking it too far at the moment. But I do think that there is a focus on domestic for the time being, and I do also think that some of the efforts that went in the tail end of last year to put some stability into the China-US relationship are still in place. There are reports of talks taking place on a bunch of issues, from fentanyl production and the components for fentanyl production coming from China being clamped down to discussions about North Korea even, and about other regional issues, including the climate. So some of the more conventional, rather boring diplomatic sort of agreements that were made in November are still in place, and I'm not seeing too much of an appetite to disrupt those channels. Not yet. I would flag, John, that there are a couple of ways where this could change. One of them is in May, we will see the inauguration of the new Taiwanese president. And that's seen as a potential opportunity where tensions could rise either before or after, depending on the tone of the inaugural speech. And if the inaugural speech is stridently pursuing Taiwanese independence or some change in status, then we could see a reaction from Beijing. And the other space where this could change, John, is not to do with Taiwan and more to do with other neighboring states in the South China Sea. And at the moment, there's a bit of a crisis going on between a bit of a steady crisis. Every week there's some sort of incident between the Philippines and Chinese Navy, and we've had one this week which looked rather serious. There was a sort of a crash between two vessels in that space, and I do think that that's the type of event that could lead to escalation of language and a shift in Chinese position. So I think it's something we mustn't take for granted. It is something we've got to monitor, but at the moment, the stability that was put in place in November seems to be holding.
Okay. When we think about all these geopolitical issues and the elections, Trump's had some interesting words of late on the relationship with Europe and NATO. We know in the past he's had some comments there. The tariff regime he prefers, but I don't think there's risks. So there's some kind of clear risks there if that's followed through. On the Biden side, I mean, honestly, if he wins, there's Republicans are probably going to take the Senate either way. So you could have a very, weak government, even if Biden wins. Again, this is very early, but that where you're dealing with the same kind of Republican obstructionism, gridlock. And look, this isn't a Republican or Democrat thing. When you have mixed government, that's what happens. So how you talk to a lot of people globally, travel a lot, you meet with senior leaders, military, political leaders. What's your sense on the approach from the world leaders out there to the U.S. elections, their view, what the risks are, or what they're worried about, or how are they seeing this as we head into election season?
So I think there's a great deal of uncertainty. I think that would be if I wanted one word to capture the sense I get from people I speak to about anticipating the US election, it is about uncertainty. And if should we see Trump take a second term, there are indicators coming out of some of the policies he might consider, but I think there's considerable scar tissue from his first term in office, where the sense was of unpredictability, of volatility, of things changing rapidly, sometimes overnight. So I think there's a degree of this sense of uncertainty is filtering across most of the people I speak to, and I think that will continue. Frankly, I think that will continue until next January, until we see an administration form up, until we see key appointments made, and until we start to see some of the tweets at the beginning of what could be a Trump administration. I also think people are trying to hedge and aim off for what they could, some of the worst case scenarios they could fear. It looked back, John, to the point I made earlier about European defence. I think this summer we will see European countries lean into a sovereign defense capability. They're going to have to do it anyway. We have a NATO conference in America in July. It's the 75th anniversary of NATO. I think by then the Europeans would want to turn up at that conference with a sense of autonomous spending. But partly that's hedging against what could be a Trump administration, and we'll see that in other areas. But it's uncertain. Nothing is nailed down. You're right to say that we should discuss this again nearer the time, or even after the election, or possibly both, John, because I think people will be making decisions at the tail end of this year. Until then, it's all hypothetical.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about either way, but who Trump in particular puts around him. What are the cabinet appointments and things like that. So I think that could be critical to a lot of different outlooks, and it might be, that uncertainty might keep itself together until who's going to be, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, things like that.
There's one other point on the sense I get of when I speak to people about how they're feeling about the geopolitics in the future. There's this uncertainty about Trump's policies, what it could be, about how it's delivered, how the consistency of delivery. But there's another element, John, which is to do with whether or not we on the outside, we foreigners look into America post-November election, and we see an America consumed with another disputed election. So if we see an election on the 5th of November that is subsequently challenged either in the courtroom or worse still on the streets of American cities, then we could be seeing American bandwidth absolutely consumed by that domestic polarization. And I think I have spoken to a bunch of people who see that as a potential and unwelcome, actually a very unwelcome sort of phase of this turn of the handle of American democracy.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we would certainly turn domestic or priorities to the domestic and could create openings for others geopolitically.
Yeah.
All right. So the last thing, which I always love asking you, because you have a way of seeing potential things that come up on the radar that certainly I'm not thinking about. In November, you flagged the risk to international shipping from the Gaza war, and it only took, unfortunately, about 6 weeks for that to really ramp up. What's on your mind this time? Is it anything? I mean, the obvious, not obvious, but the usual go-tos in this is a North Korea thing or something else, or Pakistan with their economic crisis a while ago.
Yeah.
Like, what's on your mind that I'm probably not thinking about?
So we could list a bunch of things, and then I'm going to give some good, what I think is more positive sort of things to monitor, but and then some negatives. On the positive side, I've got to be honest with you. I mentioned Turkey earlier on. I do think that the upward positive trajectory of US-Turkish relations is something to take note of, and it potentially has significance in a number of geopolitical areas, not just locally in with the Ukraine and the Black Sea, but also into Syria, into Iraq, into North Africa. Turkey has influence well beyond its local neighborhood. And the fact that there seems to be a positive dynamic going on between Washington and Ankara is a good thing. We've got the Turkish foreign minister is in Washington today. The head of intelligence was in Washington last week. There's talk of Erdogan meeting Zelensky in the near future. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see Biden meeting Erdogan at some point if this trajectory moves forward. I raise that because the alternative is not good. The alternative, which we've had for 2 years, as Turkey was blocking Sweden's accession to NATO, that was uncomfortable. Now, and I think we've got through that. So I'm putting that out there as something which from a geopolitical point of view, could have benefits in the future. But unfortunately, John, there are many negative hotspots or flashpoints to monitor. You mentioned Pakistan, but there seems to be some sort of stability in that troubled country with after the election. I have to say, I would raise North Korea as the one that I'm watching. I'm tracking an interesting conversation, which is trying to discern whether the recent uptick in rhetoric from North Korea is simply another phase that we've seen before, a cyclical phase that usually coincides with large-scale exercises from the US and Japan and South Korea, or indeed elections in South Korea. And we've got both of those. Both of those for habitual triggers are happening, that are happening now or happening in April. And we're seeing, as I said, quite uptick in rhetorical aggression, but also in missile and weapon testing from the north. Now, so far, so normal. Except one thing, John, and that's we've seen messages from North Korea which suggest that they have shifted the paradigm in which they view the South. So previously, the South was viewed as almost as occupied territory that simply needed to be reunited. Now it's seen as enemy number one of the North. And the Ministry for Reunification has been replaced in broad terms with a Ministry for War. Now, people I'm speaking to who are watching and monitoring the Korean Peninsula suggest that could be different. They're not saying it is, but it could be a sign that the cycle is no longer as predictable as it was before. So I'm tracking that, and I think that will continue. As I said a few minutes ago, that will be a dynamic that will reflect the upcoming American election in a way to position that problem in the in tray of whoever wins the election on the 5th of November, and to set the scene for what could be another round of negotiations with America after the failed talks that we saw last time Trump was president. So I'm watching North Korea, John, in this space.
I feel like that's the last thing we need is more escalation and tensions there, with the political angle to it too. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Scott, thank you as always for joining us. Thank you to our listeners and viewers for tuning in. Please make sure to follow us on social media to get more insights into markets, politics, geopolitics, and more. And I know that you and I are probably going to be speaking quite frequently this year, so I'll speak to you soon. And thank you everyone for listening.